let me quickly share my screen just for one slide. This is actually our panel discussion now, seamlessly transferred to by all of us. The panel discussion comprises all the keynote speakers plus Professor Fischer. So I cordially welcome again, although you're all here already, Dr. Thomas Buck from Edinburgh, Dr. Andrew Ross from Harvard University, Professor Linda Fisher from Cambridge, Professor Rinelle Evans from Pretoria. We talked to each other beforehand in the practice session. And of course, last but not least, and we have just seen him, Professor Terry Lamb from Westminster. So actually, we agreed upon the fact that we wouldn't actually really do a kind of statement round with everyone giving a statement, because normally in this traditional last part of our Saarbrücken conferences, just to round off the respective conference theme, these panel discussion lasted like 1.5 hours, sometimes there was overtime, nearly 2 hours. We can't do that online because sitting in front of the screen might be a little bit boring, as interesting as such a discussion might ever be. That's why I thought 60 minutes would do, so we either have to speak very fast or start immediately. Okay, so I had asked you some questions, and I think we might just go through these questions, plus some aspects from the Hoover poll, which I integrated into the file which the panelists have, and you have access to it and can also edit it. And of course, we will watch and check the Zoom here, the Zoom Q&A and chat, and also the same in Hoover. So may I ask you the first question, and I don't know who would like to be the first to answer. What is communication across borders for you, personally for you, in theory and in practice? Terry, please.
Terry wants to start.
But I mean, I will.
So Terry, you were the first orally, and Thomas, you were the first in a written form. So let's go by alphabet. Terry before Thomas. Terry, please.
Terry, yeah.
Okay, then it's not the alphabet of the Christian names. Okay, never mind. Okay, Thomas, would you like to start then, or?
I would prefer to come last. I mean, the reason is it's such a broad topic that it would take another hour or so just to summarize it. Because for me, across borders does not only mean across the borders of countries, but also across borders of disciplines. And that was something which I was trying to stress in my talk today, that I think in some way, if we need, or if we want to work in a, so to say, in a way which goes across the borders, we have also to think about the borders of disciplines. I'm very, very grateful to be able to speak as a cognitive neuroscientist and neurologist at this, to this audience. And I think we need much more dialogue, as I was trying to show, for instance, for me, the discovery of sociolinguistics, which in fact was very much started, I think, with a project where Linda and I were together. I mean, Linda will remember the MATES project, where, you know, for the first time, I was really together in a room with people coming from completely different backgrounds, and suddenly realized how much I can learn from them. I think we need more of that. And I mean, just to kind of round it up, in some way, there is a connection, I think, between those two things, namely both the national boundaries, particularly of nation states defined by languages, and the boundaries of academic subjects are a product of late 19th century. And I think that would be something where certainly other people would be much better qualified than me to speak about it. But my suspicion is that they come, so to say, from the same spirit. And therefore, trying for us to overcome them is connected with each other.
Thomas, when you just mentioned talking about this question for 1 hour, I recalled the message you sent to me when I invited you actually to this panel discussion, and you said, then we have all night to talk about this. So this very much sounded like an open-end discussion. Thank you very much. Terry, please, you wanted to add to this question as well.
Yes, I mean, you know, from my own personal commitments, I mean, I think boundary or border crossing is central to just about everything I do, really. I mean, and I talked about the different kinds of borders that I'm involved in trying to help people to cross, which are physical as well as virtual and metaphorical ones. So, you know, as Thomas said, there are different kinds. But and I've talked about some of the things, but some of those where I've been trying to find bridges in terms of, you know, the different languages that make up part of a person's repertoire and how they're connected and how they can use one to support another, etc. And they're part of the identity, but also you know, between schools and communities outside the school. I mean, between teachers I spoke about, and it may be worth saying that, you know, I was appointed at Westminster as one of 4 interdisciplinary professors as about 5 years ago. And so I work across the university, and I just, you know, I'm so tired, I think, at my age of people kind of working away individually and not sharing. So I've developed what we call the Westminster Learning Communities, which are really communities of practice to grow innovation in pedagogy and to grow educational research as well. So, and people come together from all of the 3 colleges which make up the university to collaborate in those areas and learn from one another. So I think, you know, it's something which is just really part of what I do, bringing the language teacher associations together in FIPLV. My ears pricked up when Andrew talked about his organisation, because I thought, well, yes, let's communicate there, let's make bridges there as well. So I think that's probably enough from me.
Okay, thank you very much. So what about, Linda, may I ask you, what about crossing borders or communication across borders for you?
Thanks, Thomas. Yes, I think, first of all, I'd like to say I think Rinelle did a fantastic job yesterday of talking about all the different borders. I love the metaphors that she used as well, you know, the bubbles and so forth. And for me, I'm picking up on some of that. My work is very much in practice and theory about labels, I suppose, and the power of labels and the constraints of labels. And I think that comes back to the things that Thomas and Terry are really talking about. Even as researchers, we label ourselves, we are labeled, and it constrains, but it also empowers us. It labels us to find each other as researchers and to share our work, but equally it puts us in boxes that stops us from going forward. And I think with learners, it's much the same thing. I mean, I'm rather, Terry talked about being tired. I'm a bit tired of, not tired of it, I'm disappointed about people who label themselves in ways that constrain themselves so much. And so I'm thinking very much about identity labels and about how borders that we put around ourselves in terms of identity markers can constrain us, but equally they can empower us. And how do we help people to stop bordering themselves or constraining themselves? How do we, well, when it's not helpful? I think when it is helpful and you can adopt a label or an identity that helps you to move forward, then that's wonderful. But equally, we need to think about the sorts of ways people do construe themselves and what they're capable of and help them to move forward.
Thank you very much. May I just include a technical question, because I get the feedback that you might not see the same picture as I do. I mean, of course, we can compose our own pictures in Zoom, but I see the gallery view and I can see all our panelists actually with their cameras being on, but it's not. It's okay, because otherwise we would have had to change something. If we are very playful, we can make it immersive in a lecture, or we might even then be able to look at each other. Indeed, Linda, that's exactly that. So does anyone prefer this playful way for all of us to see the same lecture hall with us inside? That's a little bit difficult for recording because there's no background then at all. I don't know, anyone who is this playfully oriented, I might, but I skip this as well. Okay, then we continue like that. Thank you very much. Rinelle, may I ask you, I mean, you told us yesterday the way you use languages to cross borders, even when going from your university back home, for example. What about you, if I may ask you?
Thank you. Well, I certainly agree at a theoretical level with some of the comments that have already been made today and in the one or two sessions that I was able to attend. I think for me, I want to use the word a burden. I have a burden for crossing borders and for people who ought to. And I'd like to pick up with what Linda's just said about identity and sort of labeling yourself. I think that my context, and here I mean broadly my South African context, is we are burdened by our immediate past, and I think we are trying to get people to understand that a racial identity, which one often sees visibly or audibly, it is not something that you need to hide. You ought to celebrate that. You ought to be proud of that. And the same applies to the languages, especially the minority languages. Ironically, the majority of our languages are, in fact, minority languages if you look at numerics or at the percentages. But some of our students in particular are actually shy to use their language, especially amongst how can I say, let's say at a residence or on campus in a cafeteria, because other groupings would mock those languages and label them with pejorative labels. So for me, the communication across borders is very localized so that we can actually be crossing borders within our very own space, namely a campus, to start with, before we even look at the bigger picture and crossing at national borders.
That's true. So this local aspect is very important as well, I think so, because sometimes we might think in very philosophical terms, but then we might overlook the chances we have around us, which is quite interesting. Sarah, you're here now as well. Thank you for joining us. What about you? I mean, I guess you working at a language center, as Andrew Ross told us beforehand as well, you by definition cross borders, don't you? Sarah, you should be able to speak. I tried to unmute you beforehand. I think you can do this on your own too. Yes, you should. Your microphone should be on. Can you hear me? And perhaps your camera works. Dr. Breslin, Sarah? There might be a technical problem. Sarah? The sentence, "Can you hear me?" must have been the most frequently used one in the past 18 months. That's what I read, at least in a French context, but I think that's
the song of our people.
Excuse me?
The song of our people.
That's true, indeed.
Am I muted? Is this on?
No, we can hear you. Then I might ask you. So, I mean, if at Harvard, that's impressive. When I read that some months ago, I couldn't believe it, that 80 languages are taught. So you're borderless by definition anyway, aren't you?
It's interesting in that we're borderless too, I suppose, in the sense that we're a locus for people from other cultures, other languages. We have in any one year about 10,000 international students, researchers, fellows on campus. When I gave you the numbers around, how many students we have at Harvard, that didn't include the Kennedy School for Government, the Harvard Business School, the Harvard Law School, the Harvard Medical School.
So that's even more.
Yeah, so we have even more. And so in terms of in terms of borders, we certainly have them. I mean, we're an institution that is sort of built on borders in some ways, and exclusivity. But we're also very much a locus for people from it's sort of fluid, right? People flow into Harvard, they flow out of Harvard. And supporting them linguistically, culturally, connecting them to the broader community is crucially important to the work that we do at the Language Center and elsewhere.
Thank you very much. So, Thomas, you had actually added another message in the chat. Would you like to dwell on this a little bit and making it a little bit more exhaustive even and complete? I can't hear you, but...
Okay, I was muted. I mean, in some way, maybe it's kind of another border. I mean, the borders are always when we have some idea, some stereotype and so on, and then hopefully start thinking beyond that. And one of the things that I mentioned today morning, and I'm very passionate about, is language learning across the lifespan. So I think it has been generally perceived that language learning is something for children, maybe for young people, school, university, and that's it. Whereas I'm passionately advocating language learning across the lifespan and in fact in retirement. I genuinely think it's one of the best activities that one can do in retirement. I mean, wonderfully intellectually stimulating, at the same time opening new worlds and producing so to say, social context, so counteracting loneliness. So in a way, you have the whole list of what practically we should do in later life, and language learning ticks all boxes. So I'm very interested, particularly because we have here people who have a lot of experience in language teaching. What is their experience of teaching older and younger people, particularly, for instance, would you say, is it better to have mixed classes? Is it better to have separate, and so on? So, or even if you don't have experience, but have some ideas how it would be, we would be very, very glad to hear your view. So that was the link that I was given. But then coming back, so in a way, it is also this kind of non-official boundary between young and old that I hope to come across with my work on language learning.
What do you mean by that? So in how far can language mastery trespass or allow us to trespass age borders, so to speak?
Well, I mean, firstly, by not doing the distinction of people being able to learn, so to say, at a young age. And then, I mean, there is I don't know other languages, I don't think German has it, or Polish. In English, you have this term, you cannot teach old dogs new tricks. And my ambition is to show you can.
I see. Okay. Another way to stay young might be, I'm just kidding, to learn foreign languages in terms of youth languages, the youth language of every generation. Then we might have enough to do, but the youngsters might not like us to understand them. Okay, that's the point. Very nice. Is there any, Terry, please, sorry. Yeah. We can't hear you. Perhaps I can help you, but you can unmute yourself as well. Yeah, okay, no drugs.
I'm saying thank you, Thomas, because you just jogged my memory about some other experiences that I've had in relation to this. So in the last school where I was teaching languages, I was head of department, we did actually have adults coming into our school classes, either beginner classes, so you had adults with 11-year-olds, but also we had some adults learning A-levels alongside our students, so 17, 18-year-olds. So that was really interesting and had a really interesting impact on the class dynamics, a very positive one, actually. But I also see it a lot because I do a lot of work with supplementary schools, the schools that are run by communities. And of course, you go to those schools and it's all generations there. And usually, you'll find alumni of supplementary school that may have been going there from the age of 3 or 4, who are now at university or working, coming back in to support as well. So it's a real mix of generations. And again, the most pleasurable places to go to. I just love going to those and working with those schools because there's so much passion across the generations, which is wonderful to see, and very motivating, obviously, for younger learners.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have a remark in the chat. Rodrigo Rodriguez from Brazil. Perhaps I can just unmute you if you would like to bring yourself in, telling us what you wrote down beforehand. This would be nice. So you should be able to speak. I mean, you're able to speak anyway, but can we hear you? That's the question.
Thank you so much. And just a comment for Thomas Bach that he mentioned about coming from different backgrounds, right? So I am undergraduated in computer science and absolutely passionate about applied linguistics. I really love that. And I was fascinated to hear about you shared that the multilingual is the normal for the brain and not the monolingual, right? Because that's what we believe using our methodology with more than 10,000 hours applying it with people from 9 to 61 years old. And we believe that the multilingual will be the new normal. The point is that we learn using a progressive level of immersion into the target language, starting with the mother tongue and the target tongue, and going, as time goes by, just into the target language, right? But whenever they shouldn't need, they go back to the mother tongue if they want to feel secure about it. And so just to share that, and that many students, the final comment, above 40 years, 50 years old, etc., that they thought they couldn't learn, they really started learning and achieving very high levels of fluency, even with official certification. And after that, going through to a third language. So really going into learning more than one language. So I was really fascinated, and my heart was burning when I heard you for the first time in a conference saying that. So that's my comment / question or sharing. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Muito obrigado.
De nada.
We can be happy if Dr. Bach still speaks languages we understand. Okay, thank you very much. So when you were talking, Mr. Rodriguez, I had another idea which is a little bit adventurous, but which might be true, so that we might perhaps say that classroom monolingualism might lead to multilingualism, because if you force students to speak the foreign language in class, which is a clearly monolingual approach, then they must, and you do this in several classes on several languages, they automatically become multilingual. What was mentioned this morning in one of our workshops by Barry Tomlin was the question of crossing borders, language communication across borders, multilingualism, mastering several languages, and identity, he said, and that's what I felt at times as well in the past. He said when he starts speaking French, he starts gesturing, which he doesn't do when speaking English, for example. So are we all different personalities when we speak different languages? And if ever you want to, you can also give us examples by speaking another language, like French or German or whatever. Please, not Zulu. This would be very difficult for us to understand. Afrikaans might still work, at least problems. So what about this aspect? Are we different personalities? Do we have different personalities when speaking different languages without even being schizophrenic then? That's another story, isn't it? Actually, in former times when I spoke French, I think I was a lot funnier than when speaking German. When speaking German, I was always very decent and formal and whatever, which might represent the image my mother tongue has. I don't know, can you feel this as well? Or perhaps, Thomas, I might ask you, because you speak so many languages, do you feel different in everyone when using them?
Well, I would say almost any multilingual person I have ever spoke about it with, including myself, would say yes. The problem is it's not an easy area to study because the question then is, how do you operationalize it? So maybe you can tell against me that I'm simply just going the easy way and studying things that we can nicely measure, attention tests where you have some, numbers you have to count and so on and so on. This is all relatively straightforward. If there is a change, you can measure it. I think this kind of feeling to be a different person Well, I would love to go into it if someone from humanities would really enlighten me a little bit on the methodology, how to approach it. I think it's a very interesting topic. And say, I mean, I don't think I've met any person who speaks, really uses more languages than one. And for me, I mean, it also relates to the question, how do we describe? Is it speaker of language, user of language? I sometimes say, it's coming back to Heidegger, whom I mentioned today morning, die Sprache ist das Haus des Seins. The language is the house of being. So I would say I have different homes. Which I can spend, and every home will have a similarity. I mean, hopefully it will have, a kitchen and a bathroom and this and that and so on. And yet every home will be slightly different. And that is for me, so to say, probably the closest metaphor to living in different languages.
I see. Thank you very much. I hope you won't find me impolite. Sometimes I get a little bit distracted because I feel like a disc jockey. I've never worked as one, but checking the Hoover Zoom Q&A session, Q&A and chat and whatever. And I just got a message from my wife on WhatsApp saying that Sarah Breslin sent an email saying she can't get connected. So she won't join, although she was there for some seconds or minutes even. I don't know. There must have been technical problems, which is actually a pity. Okay, so that's actually a miracle as well. So us speaking different languages, moving in different linguistic contexts, and being the same but a different personality. That's not so easy. Actually, I would like to include 2 or 3 aspects, there were not many anyway, from the Hoover poll. And one of these questions was, and that's actually a French one, so I'm quoting this in French, quel est le rôle de la méthode scolaire, c'est-à-dire du manuel scolaire, dans l'enseignement des langues? So the role of textbooks in language teaching. Would textbooks, I may perhaps adapt or modify this question a little bit. Do textbooks, this is actually, Rinelle, what you said in your talk, do they create or cross borders, textbooks? Because on the one hand, they are rather fixed. On the other hand, they might transfer cliches. Apart from that, many cliches are a little bit true in some respect. So what about textbooks? Andrew just said le moins possible. Qu'est-ce que vous voulez dire par là?
I'm being a little facetious, but one of the things that we've noticed is, at least in where American textbook publishers are concerned, they're often lagging changes in language pedagogy. And so it's from a purely economic standpoint, it's much easier for them to make a few changes, non-structural, in an edition of a text and then charge you an arm and a leg. I mean, it's $250, $300 US for a language textbook plus key. And we're finding that faculty members are increasingly, at least here, finding it hard to justify that expense for a manual that they use only partially, or can't rely on as the primary platform of instruction. So we're seeing a move away from that. And the other thing that I would say too is that textbook publishers, at least in the US, are increasingly, I want to put this, they're not as cognizant of learning differences and indeed learning disabilities as one might wish. So asking for things like a minimally formatted textbook so that it can be scanned for a person who is sight impaired, almost impossible. So I think they have to change the way that they do business. One of the things that we've thought about is, is there a modular approach to publication where rather than an entire book or a cursus, you publish a module, and then that can be stitched together along with other learning objects.
That would be great.
To create custom curricula.
That would be great. I mean, one of the reasons for the phenomenon you just described might be that these textbooks wouldn't sell sufficiently because the addressees would not be numerous enough, if I may put it this way. Thank you very much. We've got Terry and Rinelle. Should we say ladies first? Sorry for that. Rinelle, thank you very much.
Thank you. Two comments, one related to school, be it primary or secondary school textbooks, and then the other to an approach that we've tried, I certainly endorse at university. In recent years, the textbooks have been prepared and they are distributed across the country uniformly. In other words, well, at least provincially, at times not always across the country, but we have found that they're very scripted, and it, in my opinion, kills creativity, and it does not always take the context into account. So what I try and do is to teach students that a good teacher doesn't need a textbook. And I say that sort of working against myself as a materials developer and textbook writer. A good teacher doesn't need the textbook. A good teacher needs to see where there is language available in the environment and draw on that. In other words, the authentic material available on radio, television, newsprint, etc., etc. So again, there's sort of this ambivalence because a textbook can be very restrictive. On the other hand, it does give a beginner teacher, a novice, some form of security to work from.
That's true, but especially on higher or at higher levels of proficiency, the use of textbooks is most doubtful. That's true. I think so. Thank you very much for your contribution, Rinelle. Terry, please.
Apologies in advance if there's a barking in the background, but I'm dog sitting for my daughter at the moment, for my daughter's.
Then you're a very good father.
Been very patient all day in my various meetings, and now has come alive. Yes, I mean, I suppose just from my own experience, I mean, I tended to teach heterogeneous classes very much, so what we used to call mixed ability or all ability classes. I never found a textbook that worked that didn't need significant adapting and additions to it. So we as departments that I led, we decided in the end that we would not use them and instead develop a flexible learning approach, which enabled, and obviously there would be some classwork, but it enabled a lot of individual or pair or group work that students could select according to their own learning needs, and that might be to focus on some listening activity or on a particular level 1, 2, 3, whatever. And so we developed a bank of resources and a way of students accessing that. I'm talking about school learners, 11 to 18-year-olds. And of course, that included some of the textbooks that I found lying around in the stock rooms as well, but we could select what we thought was useful and where it would fit in. So the students were going off all over the place, finding these different things and working in that way. But no, and I mean, the other thing was that I always found that once you taught a textbook for 2 or 3 years, you were completely bored by it. And, there's nothing worse than the teacher being bored about what they feel they have to do because of this textbook. So that was my experience.
Okay, thank you very much, Terry. Linda, you told us in your plenary that actually you are in close contact with schools, of course, for your research questions, which is a little bit different from textbooks. But did you get anything which they use in terms of textbooks and whether they really cling to textbooks or there's a kind of autonomous use of them? That means you use them when you need them, but when you don't, you don't. Is there any evidence for you in this respect?
My own view, my personal view is that I think textbooks, in line with Rinelle's comment and Terry, I think it limits professionalism of teachers. I think it makes you teach to activity rather than teach to objectives. And we always encourage our trainee teachers, for example, that they should be producing medium-term plans. Someone in the chat has been talking about spiraling back and thinking on past learning, thinking about the class that they're working with, which the textbook developer, of course, to a degree can teach. I mean, when I was a teacher, I did learn to teach some things very well through using the textbook, actually. It didn't help me teach, but I didn't want to rely on the textbook. But it was very much some of the pedagogy that some of those experts were encouraging me to use. I actually find incredibly useful. Inductive grammar teaching, many of those things I find really very useful. But it does limit professional engagement of teachers with classes in front of them, with the objectives of that particular context and that particular school curriculum. So personally, I'm not very keen on them, but I do appreciate that there is a role for them. They can provide a structure, but they can limit people as well very much. And schools do tend to use them, but most language teachers, I think, do teach beyond textbooks and do try to adapt their material. We are in a lucky position, I think, in languages teaching, that we have got a lot of material available to us, all of that authentic material that Rinelle was talking about. It exists for us, and so it's rather easier for us to choose it.
Much more authentic material than we can ever find in textbooks. That's true. Classroom teaching as compared to autonomous teaching. Andrew, this is what you mentioned. You talked about a lot more safe access to language centers, for example. Will we see more autonomous language teaching, or language learning, rather, I have to say, than ever before, with people using the internet, using apps, using materials they can dominate themselves without the teachers asking them, do this, do that, things like that.
Well, it's a little tricky, right? Because there's a wide swath of people who are interested in language learning, who tend to equate apps with developing communicative competencies or intercultural competencies, right? And just from conversations with administrators at a variety of institutions, there's an appetite, pardon the pun, to appify the ways in which students learn language. The problem, of course, is that even with well-designed apps, there's not necessarily great retention of structure or an ability to use the learned forms in context, right? So there was an experiment that was actually done. The U.S. military adopted Rosetta Stone, which may be familiar to some of you, and built it into the curriculum for promotion to a different rank in the Army and a bump in pay grade. And even with that motivation, the completion rate for the language course in Rosetta Stone was something like 4%. So there was no, persistence within these particular apps is problematic. And, I think we have to do a good job as language technologists in evaluating what these apps actually produce and recommending what works and what doesn't for a variety of different purposes.
That means you mean to say that there are a lot of people who start learning a new language using a certain app, and then very soon they stop. They get bored or overwhelmed or whatever. I see. Linda, you were nodding. Okay, thank you. So your hand is up. Very nice.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. There's a couple of students working on that at the minute, and one was working on Duolingo, and it was actually interesting that she was actually looking at the washback effects into real classroom teaching from using Duolingo rather than actually using Duolingo for itself, because I think it's, as you say, Andrew, it's the pushing forward to make the progression, although some people are hugely motivated by it and by those rewards and so forth. But actually, I think if we could look at that washback a little bit more about how doing fun things on those apps can come back into real classroom learning, I think that's actually something that it's got real potential. She's going to publish something on that quite soon. But it's just an interesting, and there's another student working on theories underlying some of the apps. But I think we do need a lot more work on them because they've got such potential, but actually it's not really being exploited properly.
But as you say, or as I got from your words, if it were possible to easily combine classroom teaching and learning with app learning, that would be perfect. But of course, if you have to reach a certain level, for example, I teach rather advanced classes, and if I ask students to, and then, for example, sometimes they make huge mistakes which do not correspond to their proficiency level at all. And if I then refer them to an app, they would have to get there first to get this chapter right, which is at stake with them. So that's problematic. But if we could really also trespass this border between classroom teaching and app learning, then that would be a very nice way to act. I think, Thomas, you were first, sorry, and then Terry. Thomas, what would you like to say, if I may ask you?
Yeah, well, I just want to air my kind of worries, and I hope that I will be immediately told that, it's wrong. But my fear is that a lot of these apps see language learning basically as vocabulary learning. It's like having words and words. Now, I don't think for this audience, I need to explain that this is not the case. And this is particularly so not the case for languages which have complex morphology. Well, it might work for Chinese maybe, although it will be problematic as well. But if you go into Arabic or Turkish or whatever, then just, learning words by heart might really not be an ideal approach. And so my fear is that it could be, on one hand, very progressive technology combined with an incredibly, I would say, reactionary view of language.
Very nice, thank you. If we did app learning, students could always do Facebook in class and tell us, oh, that's the app, when we get. Okay, thank you very much. Terry, please.
Thank you. Yes, to be honest, the idea that people will be learning languages outside the formal education environment is something that has driven my work on autonomy as well. It's been partly related to that, although it's primarily about motivation, motivating our learners. But I think, my sense has always been that, particularly in an Anglophone country, we don't know which languages our citizens may need in the future. It's the same everywhere, but I think in other countries, it's kind of easy to say, well, they will probably need to learn English, and therefore they do that. But, it's a bit random as to whether we choose to do French or German or whatever. So, and so that part of the process is actually to develop lifelong learners, lifelong language learners. Hence the sort of articulation of language learning processes and reflection on learning that is built into the autonomy work. That informed, I mentioned on Wednesday that I'd been appointed 12 years ago or so by the then government to develop a diploma in languages and communication for 13 to 18-year-olds, and it was partly related to motivation and also just to involving them in language learning. And so we developed in that, and there was obviously an in-depth study of one or two languages, but there was also a module which was called self-directed learning. And in that, the task for the learners throughout that module was to decide on a language that they wanted to learn and to justify why they wanted it to learn, and to learn how to decide what they wanted to learn about that language, and so to set learning objectives, to find resources, etc., and to reflect on the process. And so they would compile a portfolio of examples of their progress and reflect on all of that. The idea was also that, given previous experiences I'd had and others, that children are often motivated by the languages that their friends speak in their classroom and in their school, that they would be able to learn one of those community languages as their language, and therefore they could use their learners, their friends as a resource for practicing, etc. So that was part of that. Now, sadly, the government changed, and the new government that came in didn't like it at all. They much preferred something much more traditional and formal. But that was just one part of that diploma. But also, interestingly, in a book that I edited called Space, Place and Autonomy, there's an interesting chapter by Alice Chick, who is at Macquarie University in Sydney, and her research there was to understand the ways in which the participants in a research project used apps, etc., resources outside, with no guidance. So they kept a diary, they could choose their language again, and it was about understanding how people learn languages and how that can be enhanced to feed that back into the ways in which we teach languages.
Okay, thank you very much. That's an important aspect. Rinelle, please. We can't hear you. Let me just, perhaps I can do something.
Es tut mir leid.
It's okay. Kein Problem.
I was picking up on the apps and learning languages, and my question is possibly directed to Andrew. Would you think that the fact the numbers have dropped so radically in terms of language learning, is it not that we now have an app that can translate what I want to say, and I sort of hold my cell phone and someone can hear what I'm asking, and I don't therefore need the language anymore, even perhaps in contexts like business and not only tourism?
It's a really interesting question. We at the IELTS conference and at some other conferences, we've had research papers presented on using Google Translate in the classroom, right? Which seems somehow antithetical, at least on the surface of it. But in fact, this is very similar to the pocket calculator problem that we had with maths, back in the day. I guess what I would say is that there's a segment of the population that may need to know, it depends on what they need to know the language for, right? If it's building vocabulary so that they can read a sign or somehow engage with a visual environment. I mean, Google will translate a sign, but other apps can help them, with words that they can navigate. I don't know to what degree the proliferation of language apps is impacting language instruction in the US. I don't know if I don't think anybody's done that sort of global research, but it's an interesting question.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes,
Thomas,
please.
can I just wanted to respond. I saw that someone was asking me to speak some Zulu.
Yes, that's true.
They shouldn't assume that because one lives in South Africa, you can speak all the languages. But I could, if you wanted me to try and do a really borderless
of course.
Activity, I could try and phone one of my colleagues who does speak Zulu, and then I could ask them to speak to the audience via my cell phone through your...
If you like to, but it's quite bothersome for you to do that, isn't it?
I can do so. I'll try.
Okay, thank you very much. Then please cut in when you are done. Thank you very much. There's also a question asked in the chat in French. Monsieur Anchy, vous avez posé une question. Alors, vous pourriez nous parler, techniquement parlant quand même. J'espère que ça va. Alors, est-ce que vous aimeriez bien reposer, peut-être détailler un peu votre question pour qu'on sache exactement ce dont vous parlez en détail?
Tout d'abord, bonjour, cher professeur.
Bonjour.
Bonjour tout le monde. Sincèrement, j'avais du mal à vous suivre en anglais, mais je n'ai pas raté cette séance, même que je n'ai pas compris beaucoup de choses. Et j'ai une question qui m'intrigue toujours à propos de l'alternance des langues, le code switching, quelque chose comme ça en anglais, dans les classes de langue.
Oui.
Alternance des langues, l'alternance codique. lorsqu'un professeur en classe, il utilise la langue maternelle, par exemple, pour débloquer certaines situations. Certains chercheurs et certains spécialistes sont pour, d'autres sont contre. Ceux qui sont pour favorisent ils l'ont considère comme stratégie pour débloquer certaines situations. Par contre, d'autres refusent catégoriquement le recours à la langue maternelle. Selon leur vision, là, ils sont en train, plutôt le professeur, par peur que le professeur risque d'installer chez les enfants une mauvaise stratégie où ils vont toujours demander cela dans la langue maternelle. Alors j'aimerais bien quel est l'avis de nos chers collègues, plutôt de nos chers professeurs ici, les spécialistes, voilà. Je sais que c'est un sujet très vague, mais en peu de temps, est-ce qu'il y a un professeur ici qui peut trancher à propos de ce point ou bien de nous donner son point de vue? Merci.
Merci.
Est-ce que c'était clair?
Pardon?
Est-ce que c'était clair ma question?
Oui, alors si j'ai bien compris, vous voulez dire que il y a des professeurs de langue, des enseignants qui excluent drastiquement l'usage de la langue maternelle des élèves en classe. Il y en a d'autres qui l'incluent et la favorisent peut-être. Hein, c'est un peu ça. Très bien.
Exactement, voilà.
Oui, très bien. Merci beaucoup. Alors, est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui aimerait bien répondre à cette question? Non. Alors, dans ce cas, ce serait moi ou... Alors moi, je veux dire que moi, je fais partie des enseignants qui excluent radicalement la langue maternelle des étudiants parce que je leur dis que dans une situation de communication, ils ne peuvent pas faire recours à leur langue maternelle parce que là, les francophones avec qui ils parlent, par exemple, ne comprennent plus rien, par exemple. Bien, alors, sinon, plus d'autres questions. Et alors, c'est aussi l'une des approches qu'on suit en Allemagne, mais pas tout à fait catégoriquement. Ça, c'est un peu le problème. Très bien. Alors, plus de réponses à cette question. Alors, merci beaucoup encore une fois, Monsieur Anchi. So, Rinelle, your hand is up. Pardon, oui, Monsieur Anchi?
Je vous en prie.
Merci bien, merci de votre question. Très bien. Rinelle, you want to say something, I guess, unless your hand was just up automatically.
I just wanted to say that I do have a colleague on the line, Dr. Connie Machabo, and she's willing to just give us a couple
That's very nice. Oh, that's very nice of you to arrange that.
In Sepedi. I hope you'll be able to hear her. Connie, jy kan met die mense praat.
Okay, dumelang. Leina la ka ke Connie Machabo, ke bolela Sepedi. Ke nna mme, ke na le bana ba bararo, ke shoma ko University ya Pretoria. Ke rata polelo ya ko gae kudu, ha mmogo le setso sa ko gae. Is that all, Prof? Can I?
Thank you very much. That's very nice. Can it be?
I was just telling them that who I am. I'm your colleague. I've got 3 children. I work at the University of Pretoria, and I teach Sepedi as a language. I'm passionate about my language and my culture.
Very nice. Thank you very much. I guessed you had an introduction phase because I got your name in Pretoria. Okay, thank you very much. That was very nice. Thanks, Rinelle, and your colleague. That's great. That's really trespassing borders and crossing them. Okay. So I think there was no, because Thomas, you had several remarks in the chat some minutes ago. Would you still like to talk about them? And then we still have a question from Mr. Rodrigo in Brazil. Okay, now it should work.
Yeah, I have posted a link to a blog which I have written for a International Day of Multilingualism, 27th of March, the year before, about living in different languages, because that is something, that is a question which I find very kind of relevant. Obviously, the terms such as native speaker and so on are quite problematic. Now, as I say, I know some of my colleagues like the term language user, so L1 user, L2 user, because speaking is kind of too narrow because it refers only to speaking, not to writing. And to be honest, so if anybody has an idea, please tell me. I'm still not sure what would be a good term to describe it. As I say, for me, the metaphor is to live in different languages, but language liver is not a good word in English. So I'm really genuinely not sure what would be a good word to describe the interaction that we have between the language and ourselves. I think, user is for me something like, you use a tool, a computer, very much top down and so on. For me, it's an interaction between me and the language. It's not that I am different. It's a different interaction. That's why I have this metaphor of houses. I interact differently and therefore it makes me different, but it's not really just a one-sided instrumental use. The languages have influence on me.
I see. So if different languages are different houses, then it might be a kind of language empire. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. That was not serious. Okay, we've got a question from Jorge Sagaro in the chat, who is saying, as an English teacher, I have found exercises in some apps that make no sense for the students, neither for teachers. Humbly, I think that teachers are necessarily not only to guide, or are necessary, not only to guide our students, but also to help them to really learn the language correctly. Linda, by what you said beforehand, I guess you would agree, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think ideally, yes. Ideally, yes. I think you can learn it through an app. Having said that, as you can learn through TV, you can learn through lots and lots of different media. I think that's definitely the case. But I think ideally for communicative and for pushing you forward and teaching you how to learn and thinking about strategies and so forth, teaching a teacher, a real interlocutor is going to help a lot.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions. I think I don't want to overuse your time, but I think, Thomas, what you said, we can talk about this all evening. No problem. I'm just kidding. That's not so unrealistic. Ms. Kavec, would you like to answer to ask your question, please? It seems you have one because your hand is up.
Yes, sorry, I can't turn my camera on because of some technical reasons, but my question is about this issue of identity. You have been talking about that we become different person when we speak different languages. So do you think it's also the same for language teachers? Like, do they become different teachers when they teach different languages? Because I have had this experience. I have been teaching English as a foreign language for nearly 7 years, and they asked me to teach my native language, Turkish. And at that point, I realized that I was a totally different teacher. So what are your thoughts about this issue, not just on the side of the language learners, but also the language teachers? Does it also make them a different teacher?
Okay, just a quick remark, because Tevi, you put in the chat, that's what Thomas Beck, maybe inhabit a language instead of live in a language. That appears to be quite a nice term. But I don't know about you, Thomas, but to me it sounds very nice, if I may say so.
Inhabitant or dweller, maybe that's a good one, yes?
So
it doesn't get over the problem of the liver, because you can't say an inhabitant either. So.
Yeah, I think inhabitant is okay, and dweller maybe.
I suppose so.
That's quite nice. Thank you very much, Tevi. Okay, so then, Mr. Rodriguez, please, your second question for today.
Oui, merci. Premièrement, je voudrais seulement commenter sur le monsieur qui a demandé la question sur la langue maternelle pour enseignement, de langue étrangère. Ici, nous utilisons toujours la langue maternelle, mais pour le niveau débutant. Et comme le temps passe, nous sommes en train d'une transition pour utiliser seulement la langue étrangère. Oui, mais parce que il y a des fois que l'étudiant est en train de sentir comme le monsieur qui a demandé la question, qui devrait ici demander en anglais. C'est impossible, peut-être. Oui. Alors, c'est ça que il y a des fois que des étudiants sont en train de sentir les paniques sur ça. But my question is about what is the role of the brain in learning languages? What is the importance of understanding how the brain works and how we could take great advantage of this. Thank you.
Have you got anything planned for tomorrow? No, I'm not serious. Thomas, please make it short and biteable, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I think I truly can't. I think one of the problems is, and in fact, one of the talks today afternoon was about neuromarketing and, CLIL techniques and so on. I think the word neuro is now being added to almost anything just to increase the value. And very, very rarely is there any neuroscience connected to it. Mm-hmm. So yes, of course, there is a lot of neuroscience of language learning, but as I say, it's difficult to put it in one sentence or two. I mean, I was trying to read a little bit my talk today morning, and I would say the important thing is that brain is absolutely perfectly able to deal with many languages. They don't cause confusion. If anything, they are supporting, so to say, the emergence and maintenance of different neural networks. So that would be probably the kind of shortest summary that I would give.
Thank you very much. Linda, thank you very much for your answer to Pilar. You said you held a conference in Cambridge in 2019 on multilingualism and identity and might have another one. So we can't compete with Cambridge, so then we are out.
No, it's not at all. That is not at all to say don't tread on our territory. The more conferences on identity we have, the better. Absolutely. No,
I'm kidding, but the first part of my sentence was true, of course. But thank you very much for this remark. But it seems there was one question by Liza Stewart, which was not answered yet. She said something like, so at 6:26, she said, a good discussion about apps. Sometimes I wonder how much some app developers actually confer with language teachers, researchers on approaches, or whether it's just a form of gamification. And I mean, I think that might be true. So we're playing around with language without really decently and seriously learning them. Or what is your experience and your attitude towards that? If there's someone who would still like to get back to the app question.
And just very briefly, there are a number of app developers that are well-versed in second language acquisition and have built the apps with particular strategies in mind. I think one just has to understand that apps are fit for some purposes and not for others, and eliding those boundaries to the extent that an app is no longer fit for purpose. Leads us to the conclusion that all apps are not well suited for language learning. It's all about task.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps the last question for you, perhaps first, or in general, Andrew, because you said you're very technology savvy. What do you think about technology, language learning, and the future? Where will we get? Is it your Viz lab? Harvard is very rich and compete with you, or at least with Anglo-American universities. At least we in Germany and other European countries we can't. So is it something like the Viz lab, which you are setting up in Harvard? Is that the direction, or where will we go?
So that's such an enormous question. I guess what I would say is that so many parts of our lives at this point are already mediated with technology, right? Mediated through technology. This conference, for example, that it's a question of adapting technological types rather than specific apps or others to the purposes of L2 acquisition, whether that is instruction, whether it is self-access learning, whether it's simply exposure to different languages, identities, and cultures. So I don't think there's any going back, but I also think that we could do a better job as first of all, teacher trainers and as instructors in helping our students navigate the landscape of technology as it's applied to language learning, because they really don't, one should not expect them to have critical perspectives on what's laid out in front of them for language instruction. That really is on us. So I guess that's where I'd leave that particular point.
Thank you very much for your short answer and deep answer. Thank you very much. Is there anything you would like to say, anything which is still on your minds? And do that within 30 seconds. No, I'm just kidding. Thomas, I think you wanted to say something. No. Okay. So then I do thank you very much indeed. We have had a very high-ranking round of researchers with us. It honors us to have you and have had you for this panel discussion. Thank you very much. And should any microphones be open, please join me applauding for you as panelists. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart.